Hey everyone, welcome to week one. Hopefully you've had a chance to orient yourself to the course by working through the orientation module and reviewing the syllabus and the course calendar. If you have any questions that seem to be universal, like other students might be asking, go ahead and post it on the discussion board that's called Class Questions and Answers. If it's anything more personal, please feel free to email me in Canvas and I'll get back to you within 24 to 48 hours. I will do my best to get back to you within 24 to 48 hours. Most of the lectures in this course are going to be in a video PowerPoint type fashion. So what that looks like is typically I will be using PowerPoints and there'll be a little box in the corner of me chatting about the slides. I will also post the PowerPoint itself. That is not a video, so you can refer back to it and not have to watch the entire thing. Assignments will also have videos attached to them. So because of the forced online learning environment, we are unable to role play, which is best for these types of assignments for practicing doing assessments, practicing treatment planning. However, there are ways to do that in the online platform. However, life is challenging right now, and I know that Zoom and the online platform is new to many folks, and so I thought it was best to not add any more challenges to the list, and we are going to do these assignments individually. So how that will play out is I will be role-playing the assessment, the treatment plan, as well as the mental status exam and discharge plan, and provide those videos to you so you can see how it looks in practice. And then I will also upload videos on how to complete each assignment. And again, the lectures will be in the format that we're about to move into now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So for today, we'll be talking about trauma stewardship and how to care for ourselves while caring for others. So there's a few major things in common, no matter where you work within the behavioral health field. So whether you are a case manager or a therapist working in substance abuse specific treatment or mental health treatment, there's going to be a few things in common. Trauma is number one. Most of the people that we interact with, most of our clients have experienced trauma. There's an undeniable and significant link between trauma and behavioral health disorders. And we are likely going to be affected by the heartache and the stories that we hear and the people that we interact with. Something that I wish I had learned about earlier in my education was how to deal with these feelings, how to take care of myself while caring for folks who have experienced things that nobody should have to experience, and how it can be difficult going on and living your life in the way that you had before you started working in this helping profession. And a major piece of that is because it's not really possible to endure and hear people's stories and what's happened to them, and not hold on to a piece of that and have it affect us in our daily lives. We call this vicarious trauma, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But I thought that it was really important to start this course and rip off the proverbial Band-Aid, if you will, of most of us are here because we have this, this passion for helping people, and that's wonderful. But sometimes it's not always known when we're coming into this field how much is going to affect us. And so I wanted that to be really one of the fundamental ideas of this course, is that it's not all about caring for the patients. We have to care for ourselves in order to care for them properly, okay? So again, significant link between trauma and behavioral health disorders. With that being said, the research shows that about 90% of the people that we'll work with in the behavioral health field have experienced trauma. And about 75% of people being treated for substance use disorders report a trauma history. Because we don't have a shared or universal definition of trauma across cultures and across people, I think that finding these numbers can be difficult. And I would actually argue that it's probably more like 100% of people who experience severe and persistent mental illness, so mental illness that affects them across the lifespan, or substance use disorders, have experienced trauma. In the 1990s, there was a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. And in this study, excuse me, let me back up a little bit. So Vincent Politi, he was the head researcher of Kaiser in California, and they opened an obesity clinic, a very successful obesity program where folks were transported. They were even compensated for their time in the program, and it turned out to be very successful. This group of women decided to drop out of the program despite positive outcomes, and Vincent Politi conducted exit interviews on these folks to figure out why are you discharging from a program that is so helpful. Excuse me. And what he found was that 90% of the folks who had dropped out had experienced sexual abuse in childhood. And so that led to this idea that there's a correlation between obesity and trauma, which led to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. So in this study, 17,000 people, 17,000 Kaiser insured people, so we're talking primarily white, employed, middle-class folks, were given an Adverse Childhood Experiences assessment. And so there were 10 questions asked regarding: had you experienced physical, sexual, or emotional abuse in childhood? Did you experience neglect? Did you experience or witness domestic violence? Did you experience the loss of a parent, whether that's due to death, incarceration, or divorce? And did you have a parent who had a substance use disorder or a severe and persistent mental illness? And then they also had medical evaluations done that determined what they were at risk for across the lifespan, and it also evaluated any current medical issues that they were experiencing. And the study found that about 70% of people had experienced at least one of those adversities in childhood. 40% had experienced 2 or more, and 25% had experienced 4 or more. And what the study led us to is that there's a dose-response relationship between adversity and negative health outcomes across the lifespan. So what I mean by that is the more adversities somebody experienced in childhood, the more likely they are to experience obesity, coronary artery disease, as well as earlier initiation of sex, earlier initiation of smoking. They were more likely to have STDs. They were more likely to use substances or alcohol. Also more likely to attempt suicide or have a severe persistent mental illness. And when I say more likely, I'm talking about about a 5,000% greater risk of having these things opposed to somebody who had not experienced adversities in childhood. And so Martin Tecker is a world-renowned trauma researcher, and he utilized this study to determine that if adversities in childhood and household dysfunction no longer occurred, he theorizes that drug abuse in general would be reduced by 50%, alcohol abuse by 2/3, and IV drug use by roughly 75%. So with that being said, the folks that we are going to be working with in the mental health field, the substance abuse field, these are the people who have experienced trauma. Okay, these are the people that we are going to see and work with every day. So what does that mean for us? So I'm sure many of you have heard of vicarious trauma, but there are other subsections, if you will, of vicarious trauma that we're going to go over. So the first is secondary traumatic stress. So in secondary traumatic stress, this is when we actually start mirroring PTSD or other trauma symptoms of the people that we're serving. So for instance, if avoidance of triggers, which is a common PTSD or a common trauma symptom, is something that the client that we're working with experiences, we might find ourselves later on avoiding those same triggers subconsciously. We're not even thinking about it. It's just something that's kind of been ingrained in us from so much work with this person. So that's an example of secondary traumatic stress. It's not as common as the rest of them, but we do see it pretty frequently. Also, what we call moral injury. You've probably heard this described as burnout. So this is the cumulative toll of demands of the workplace, of working with folks who have experienced severe trauma or having severe altered mental states. I don't like to call this burnout. I like to refer to this as moral injury because I think burnout implies that the victim, if you will, is to blame. Like, I don't have enough skills or I don't cope well enough, so I'm experiencing burnout. And that's actually not the case. Unfortunately, the organizations that we work for and the systems that we work within demand a lot from us without caring for us. And so burnout doesn't make sense to me. We live in a world that is abnormal, where people are traumatized, people are hurting, and we have to come to work every day and find solutions and facilitate change within these folks. And I think that moral injury makes much more sense to define that dynamic. Compassion fatigue. So this is also a cumulative toll that can be taken on us when we constantly feel the need to provide empathy for folks. And this is a tremendous personality trait or characteristic to have, and it's necessary in the field. There's no doubt about that. But when that empathy is turned on all the time because we have a big caseload and then we have families to go home to, that can take a toll on the body, and we call that compassion fatigue. And then vicarious trauma, which is the major response for working with those who have experienced trauma, or the one that we see the most frequently, occurs when our worldview actually changes based on the traumatic experiences that we share with our clients. So for example, let's say that I have a patient who, so I worked with children prior to working as a crisis intervention therapist. And what I found in the children that I was working with specifically was that the males in their household, whether it was a sibling, I worked primarily with girls, whether it was a sibling or a paternal figure, stepfather, all of them were physically abusive. And so while logically, I know that not all men or boys are abusive, it really started to show itself in my interactions and my relationships with men in the workplace, at home. And I kind of had like this subconscious worldview change in the sense of men are abusers, okay? And I interacted and responded to life in that way. And so that's just an example of vicarious traumatization. So hearing trauma, hearing stories of trauma, that impact the way that we perceive the world. So again, vicarious trauma is the cumulative effect of working with survivors of trauma and includes cognitive changes resulting from empathetic engagement and a change to the worldview. So some of the effects of vicarious trauma. So we talked about some of the interpersonal effects, but behaviorally, this can excuse me, 1 second. I lost my train of thought. Okay. So behaviorally, we might see increased symptoms of isolation, increase in alcohol or substance use, difficulty sleeping, impacts to our eating habits. We might even begin engaging in risky behaviors or avoid certain people, places, or things. And we might find it very difficult to leave our work at the door when we get home. Interpersonal problems I spoke to somewhat, but we can certainly have impacts on our relationships, whether that be a whole group of people or this could just simply be going home and not being able to engage with our family or our loved ones in the same way. Not being able to be present, not being able to listen, not being able to help our friends and family or listen to them when they're experiencing a problem because we're just so saturated in trauma at work. We can also have emotional symptoms. We could experience grief, anxiety, irritability, anger. We can experience frequent distractions, like I had said, inability to listen, changes in mood. We might not be laughing as much, and we might even feel generally unsafe. Also, cognitive changes. So one of the major symptoms of hypervigilance and anxiety, which is very common in folks who have experienced trauma, is black and white thinking. So something that our brain waves change when we experience anxiety. And those brain waves cause our higher functioning to turn down by about 80%. So our ability to rationalize, think clearly, see the gray area in life, that goes away when we are in a state of anxiety or hypervigilance. And as I said before, that can rub off on us, okay? We can also experience physiological symptoms, so affect our overall well-being. We can experience ailments such as headaches, rashes, ulcers, or heartburn. Also, autoimmune diseases are common for people who have experienced trauma vicariously or directly. And also, sometimes we see spiritual implications, so decreased sense of purpose or meaning in life. We don't feel connected to our loved ones. We feel unworthy of love and belonging. So some of the warning signs of vicarious traumatization are helplessness and hopelessness. So helplessness being, I am not taking care of myself, whether that mean hygiene-wise or nutrition, not exercising. I have a hard time engaging in my adult duties, whatever that may be. Hopelessness, a sense that one can never do enough. I know in my experience at the beginning of my career working with children, I never felt like my job was done. I never felt like I had done enough to help these children that I was working with. Hypervigilance, so that constant state of alertness or that constant state of I need to survive right now. My body and my brain feel like I'm in threat, so I'm in what we call survival mode. Also diminished creativity. Trauma whether experienced vicariously or directly, is experienced, is stored in what we call the creative part of the brain. And so if we are experiencing hypervigilance due to traumatization, we see diminished creativity. Also, the inability to embrace complexity. So the ability to think critically, the ability to formulate our own thoughts and ideas. We tend to, another warning sign is also to minimize problems, like, oh, it's not that big of a deal, or I've heard worse. Also, again, substance misuse. Sometimes we can be overly empathetic and jump to the other side of the spectrum where we're unable to empathize at all. We've completely numbed that part of us because it's painful. Chronic exhaustion, which we discussed. Avoidance. So this might be avoidance of work duties, avoidance of clients, avoidance of triggers or people, places, and things in the environment. Dissociative moments. And so some people describe dissociative moments as either being in a dreamlike state or losing time, or part of dissociation too is this idea that like our brain and our body are no longer connected. We don't feel holistically. We don't feel like we're an entire person. Dissociation looks very different from person to person. Also feeling a sense of persecution. Everybody's out to get me. It's a very common feeling in traumatized folks, vicariously or otherwise. Guilt, fear, anger, and cynicism. Sometimes we see grandiosity and mania to some degree, where essentially helping others has become euphoric, and we feel like we have to provide care, or we're the only ones able to fix the problem or to fix the client, okay? So there is a book called Trauma Stewardship, which is where most of the information from this week's slides has come from. This book changed my life. It changed my career. I had reached a point a few years ago where I didn't know that if this was for me anymore, if working in the behavioral health field, just because my heart was so heavy. Couldn't leave my work at the door. My relationships were implicated by my experiences. And so my therapist has suggested this book, and it's by Laura Van der Noot Lipsky. And you can access this at the Clark County Library. I know they're not open right now, but there is an ebook library that has a copy or two there. So if that's something that you're interested in reading, please do. I also have a copy if anybody would like to borrow it. But she talks a lot about combating vicarious trauma. So chances are we're going to experience it no matter what. But how we experience it, to what degree it affects our lives, can be changed. So one of the first suggestions is creating space for inquiry. So if I was working with a patient, one of the major suggestions that we make here is that we create space and time for self-reflection. And that's going to look very different from person to person. This could be, why are we here? What's my purpose in life? Where do I want to go? But for trauma stewardship specifically, I think really having a good understanding of why am I here? Why am I in this field? What motivates me to be here? What drives me to keep going? What am I passionate about? That type of thing. And also determining, is trauma mastery a factor for me? Am I trying to fix myself, or am I trying to treat or cure myself, if you will, of my experiences? I think coming into the field, that was my story. I wanted to learn and read everything I could so that I could essentially fix myself. It didn't work out. I do have to, even though I am a therapist, I do have a therapist with good reason. Um, and I realized that I can get as many degrees as I want and read as many articles as I can and conduct research and whatever. But at the end of the day, my work with others can complement the work that I'm doing with myself, or for myself rather, but it's not a replacement for the work that I need to do. Okay, so establishing, um, what are my goals here? What motivates me? And then also considering, is this working for me? You might find in 2 years that, or maybe a job specifically, is too overwhelming, and really checking in and knowing that this isn't the end all be all. There are many roles that we can take in behavioral health care, and some of us will find that working face to face with patients is not where we want to be, and that's okay. Engaging in self-care. So how we define self-care differs tremendously. If you're on Facebook and you're, reading their articles, they're probably talking more about, taking baths, getting your nails done, that kind of thing. That's not the kind of self-care we're talking about here. While those things can be wonderful, they're not enough. And so doing things that make us feel good, of course, is a part of that. But when I talk about self-care, I'm talking about increasing stress resistance. And so there is another trauma expert, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a book many years ago on psychological trauma. And the folks who have experienced trauma and have positive outcomes later on in life, he found a couple things in common among them. Number one, a sense of personal control. So to some degree, some radical acceptance, accepting the things that I can't control and being able to determine what I can control. And for the most part, that's going to be me and my actions, or yourself and your actions. So really driving that home and really understanding, like, I am not going to put in energy trying to control things that inevitably I can't. Okay, so they have a good sense of that. They also pursue personally meaningful tasks. And so life isn't all about work. Sorry for the hard work. Some of us go to work to avoid our own problems, or because we're having problems in the family unit, or whatever the case may be. And that's fine, but having something outside of work that brings us meaning and purpose to our lives is something that they had in common also. Healthy lifestyle choices, nutrition, and mental health is not something that we learn a lot about in our educational programs. But what we know now is about 95% of our serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter responsible for the regulation of mood, is produced in the gut. And so there is a direct link between what we're putting in our stomach and our mental health. And that is something that absolutely has to be considered. So eating whole, nutritious food as much as possible, eliminating barriers to food security, making sure that we're exercising multiple times a week, 3 to 5 times a week, 30 minutes a day. And the book by van der Kolk does talk about intense exercise. So whatever that looks like, 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, but any kind of exercise, walking, swimming, dancing, it doesn't matter. Just engaging in some type of physical activity, along with nutrition and adequate water. Also social support. So the most stress resistant people that he studied had social buffers to their stress. So what that looks like for me, I live in what we call an intentional community with my family, and there are multiple people who live on my property within my household, and we have dinners together, we have meals together, we play games together, we talk about our workday together, we talk about our stressors, and that is probably the number one thing that has given me strength throughout my career, is having people that I can bounce ideas off of, that I can process with, that I can love, that I can laugh with. Um, so in treatment, while we're treating patients, that is going to be something that we drive home probably on a daily basis, but we need to be able to transfer that to ourselves also. Supportive, healthy, supportive relationships are the number one buffer and resiliency factor for trauma. Living in the present, living in the present moment. So many of us experience toxic stress. That's just the world that we live in, and it's unfortunate, but it is reality. And so, again, with that constant state of hypervigilance or anxious energy, it's really hard to be able to live in and focus on what's in front of us. We're worrying about how we're going to survive in the future, or we're dwelling on the past. And what we know is finding ways to be present, to actively listen to whoever's in front of us, to be with or be in whatever state we are, rather than hyper focusing on the future or the past. So there are many ways to find and maintain clarity and wisdom in the face of suffering. And until we're able to slow down enough to honestly feel how we're doing, we cannot assess our current state and what our needs are. So again, allowing that space for self-reflection and being able to determine how we feel in conjunction with our work or our clients is important. And if we don't find ways to maintain a presence, sometimes we find ourselves numbing. This could be through substance use, reality TV, toxic relationships, overeating, whatever the case may be. But it's back to that idea of avoiding and not living our lives. So Peter Levine, another brilliant trauma researcher, he talks about attuning to our felt sense. And so again, that's just the ability to look internally and see, oh, this is my response to that trigger. This was my response to that comment, or this is my response to that patient. And really being able to explore and determine the feelings that arise within us due to the trigger can take the power out of, can potentially help us to navigate those processes more appropriately, and thus enabling us to navigate the external world more productively and proactively. So choosing your focus. So sometimes when we're overwhelmed, we tend to hyper-focus on our shortcomings, where we're going wrong, or what's wrong with this patient, or what's wrong with my coworker, or fill in the blank, okay? So I think, again, with time and space for self-reflection, we're able to say, what am I putting too much energy into? So I know something for me historically was body image. Like all of my actions were determined by who was gonna see me, what I was gonna look like, did I have to wear a bathing suit, that type of thing. And I noticed that I'm missing out on a lot of my life and a lot of fun and a lot of experiences because I'm worried about what I look like. And so that's just an example of hyper-focusing on something negative when I could open up that bandwidth for other things that are productive, okay? So determining, what are we hyper-focusing on? Is this productive? And then a part of choosing your focus also is maybe determining, is there a plan B if this career is not working out for me? What else would I like to do if for whatever reason? So I think, especially having a degree specifically in applied human services or counseling or whatever, we assume that whatever career choice that we choose, we're stuck there. And again, as I said before, there's many roles we can play in the behavioral health system. And so considering what those options are could be beneficial. So just a little quote here. In every moment, we decide where to place our attention. Focusing on negative, painful, troubling events can become habitual. It takes discipline to raise our gaze, look away from our accustomed pain, anxiety, and worries, and truly see the world through different eyes. We can literally habitualize pessimism. We can also habitualize gratitude and optimism. The more and more that we engage in a certain behavior, the more natural, if you will, it becomes. The more likely we are to choose that pathway in the future. For thinking about, synaptic pathways in the brain. So for instance, stress. I'm experiencing stress. Typically, if my response is to use alcohol, that becomes a natural response to stress. So I've done it so many times that my brain has habitualized it. And sometimes we need to refocus that pathway, if you will, and consciously make a decision to do something different so that something more positive and proactive becomes our new natural response. So I focus on what I was able to do that day. I focus on what went well, what changed, what moved, and what I was able to do. And the rest I leave behind at the end of the day. And so throughout the Trauma Stewardship book, there are many quotes and stories from folks in the field, all aspects of the helping industry. And it gives a lot of personal insight as to how people work through vicarious trauma. So check out the book if you can. Another facet for combating vicarious traumatization is building compassion and community. So it's a support group. So whether this is by definition the support group that we go to, our coworkers, or a team that we're working with, our family, our friends. As students, you're part of a community or a microculture. And so a microculture is a community that nurtures us by emphasizing a different set of values than the culture at large. So having a support network of people who understand vicarious trauma, in this case, or understand whatever the problem is, who can relate to us, who can offer suggestions if warranted, finding something to belong to, somewhere we can be heard and felt and understood. Again, back to the idea of healthy relationships being the strongest resiliency factor. And then practicing compassion for self and others. So recognize ways. So one of the biggest things in self-compassion and compassion for others is realizing and recognizing the power and vulnerability in our relationships. So what I mean by that is, to some degree, I have authority and power over patients that come to see me. I get to determine their treatment. In another role that I take in an inpatient unit, I'm part of the court process where we hold people involuntarily sometimes because they're a danger to themselves and others. I have the ultimate power there, and I need to recognize that in order to be able to, I need to recognize their role as well as my own to try to understand the dynamics of the relationship and how, and really tap into how it must feel to be involuntarily held in a psychiatric unit. Finding ways to be relatable, finding ways to conjure up compassion for others. it keeps us humble. Um, and humility is, as we'll see in the Building a Therapeutic Alliance section of this class, is humility something we need to bring to the table in order to build effective therapeutic alliances with our patients. Other ways to practice compassion: eliminate threats and toxic stressors as much as possible. We're not going to be able to do that completely, unfortunately. This is life. And so, but eliminating toxic relationships or addressing toxic relationships at work or eliminating stressors as much as we possibly can help us find compassion. Also, do no harm. If you can't help somebody, find somebody who can. And if you can't, just simply state it. Like, this isn't my expertise. I don't really know if I can help here. We need to make sure that we're not harming our patients. And we can do that by practicing modalities or certain treatments that we are not well versed in or that we're not trained in. So that is one of the ethical pillars of the helping profession, is to do no harm. Also, be an advocate. Being a frontline counselor, therapist, helper is great, and that is enough. However, some people find that working on a more macro level and providing advocacy, so standing up for, I don't know. But for example, I do hold a chemical dependency credential, and something that I do advocate for, and I am on a campaign for legalizing small amounts of substances, or decriminalizing certain amounts of substances for folks in Portland. And instead of incarcerating these folks, offering them treatment is a campaign that I serve on. And so that's an example of being an advocate, because learning and growing and understanding the policies and procedures or the barriers that people have against them can certainly increase our compassion towards them. And then also considering how best to respond to conflict in the workplace, in our family, with our clients, whatever the case may be. We are mentors to the people that we serve and to our coworkers. And so they are going to respond to that and potentially model our behaviors. And so responding to conflict compassionately, if that means we have to take a step back or take a deep breath or go silent for a second, whatever the case may be, we need to respond to conflict compassionately, especially in the workplace. So another quote here from a child welfare services worker on a reservation: "I've deepened my compassion so as to keep from numbing. I just try to look at every person as an individual and within a larger context of generational trauma, and it helps me connect. I'm grateful for that deeper compassion. It keeps me feeling." So just so you know, intergenerational or generational trauma is trauma that happens to people as a whole. So one of the last pieces here of combating vicarious trauma is finding balance. So back to the idea of engaging in meaningful pursuits outside of work. Have a life outside of your job. Also, do your best not to hyper-focus on one thing. Engage with a spectrum of emotions. So what I mean by that is if you're constantly serious, astute, getting things done, try to laugh some, or even feel feelings of sadness. Try not to run from them or avoid them. Emotions are completely normal. We're going to feel a range and a spectrum of emotions throughout our lives, maybe throughout the day, maybe even throughout a conversation. And so embracing and engaging with those emotions. And also practicing gratitude. Again, we live in a harsh world. And so it's normal normal to, experience scarcity, toxic stress, um, and sometimes it makes it difficult for us to see the good in the world, but it's there. And so practicing gratitude is one of the surefire ways to get those synaptic pathways rolling, and also seeking the good in the world. And then engaging in daily centering practices. So explore and determine what brings meaning or helps you appreciate the meaning of life. Do things that strengthen your value and purpose in life, and determine what brings you peace, joy, or hope on a daily basis. So for me, what that looks like, I have breakfast with my partner every morning. We talk about things. It's kind of an unspoken rule that we don't talk about work. Like we talk about certainly things we have to do at home, or dreams or aspirations that we have for the future. I also meditate and do yoga and intense exercise multiple times a week. Something that I've also been doing for years is taking some time at night to sit in silence and focus on my day, evaluate if there was anything I could have done differently, and certainly talking about what went well that day. That's actually something that my family and I share together at the table every night is what are two things that went well today, what's one thing that made you laugh, and what's one thing that you're angry about or what made you sad. And so that is a narrative that happens in my household every night. And it really helps me to center and really understand what my life looks like and what I'm going through. Like rather than just surviving and going through the notions, like I feel it and I experience it. And so again, the resource for this book, or excuse me, the major resource for this presentation is the Trauma Stewardship book. Again, you can find it in the e-library for Clark County. I think the school library also may have one. I'm not sure if you can access it. Also, traumainformedoregon.org is a great resource for combating vicarious traumatization, what that looks like. And then SAMHSA also has a publication called Tip 57, which is about trauma-informed care and behavioral health. And that is how to care for folks who've experienced trauma. And again, how to care for ourselves. If you have any questions about this presentation, please email me, or again, if it's universal, please post it on the class questions and answers board. And I look forward to meeting you all soon.